Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Before giving our version of the aquaculture story, let me make just a couple of comments about the theme of the conference, telling our story. First, we have to have a story. Now, there can be multiple stories, of course, but one of those stories has to be for the general public. That means it has to be devoid of jargon, and it has to assume what psychologists call preconceptual innocence, and one that not only points out the advantages of marine aquaculture, but also addresses the public's concerns and perceptions. The public aquaculture story should be a chapter in the story of the future of food. To date, aquaculture has been relegated to a footnote and often a dismissive footnote. But in the future, aquaculture, and particularly marine aquaculture, must be a major chapter in the story of the future of food and the need to create and sustain a safe, secure supply of nutritious food that is scalable to meet the needs of a growing population. So, I'm now going to describe what our story is at the Aquarium of the Pacific and our Seafood for the Future program. Homo sapiens, our species, date back some 200 to 300,000 years. For more than 95% of our history, we were hunter-gatherers, living in small groups of 20 to 40, wandering over the landscape in search of food, primarily fruits and nuts, but also some terrestrial animals and some seafood. 70,000 years ago, something very dramatic happened. A volcano called Toba in Indonesia erupted. Some contend that it spewed out so much ash that the Earth went into the equivalent of a nuclear winter for several years. Temperatures crashed and much of life was extinguished. Anthropological evidence indicates that at about this same time, Homo sapiens almost went extinct, perhaps because of this event. The human population was reduced to a few thousand breeding pairs, and many of them lived in South Africa on the East Coast in an area called Pigeon Point. They lived in caves, and they survived by eating shellfish and some finfish. There are some scientists who contend that the ocean and seafood saved our species from extinction. So the ocean saved humanity once. Can it save us again? It may have to. 10 to 12,000 years ago, there was a major change in human food practices. It was then that we began to practice agriculture. Population at that time globally was estimated to be only between 5 and 6 million people. But with a predictable food supply, people could settle down into villages. Villages became towns. Towns became cities, and population exploded. Through a series of green revolutions, we avoided the mass starvation that had been predicted by Malthus and Paul Ehrlich and others. But these green revolutions came at a cost. Today, agriculture uses 70% of all developed fresh water, more than half of Earth's ice-free land surface, and it takes an increasingly large toll on the Earth and on the ocean. Aquaculture came along later, began perhaps 4,000 years ago in China with the rearing of carp in ponds. The Romans kept oysters and they fattened fish in specially designed tanks, but it wasn't until the Middle Ages that pond farming techniques began to be developed, and this was particularly true in monasteries to provide a non-meat source of protein and for the many days of required fasting. And in many churches, seafood is still exempt from fasting. It's very clear that if we're going to increase food production, and we must, according to the UN, we need to produce 70% more food by 2050 to feed an additional 2.5 billion people. Present agricultural practices certainly are not scalable to meet this demand. There's not enough water, there's not enough land, and the environmental burden is too large. But of course, agriculture is also changing dramatically. There are numerous innovations that are happening now. Precision farming, where the amount of fertilizer is applied to match what's needed and no more. And also crops are matched to soil type and to climate. And we have vertical farming. This isn't the old green roofs that we hear about. This is growing crops on different levels within buildings. And this is particularly happening in Europe. And growing beef in the laboratory. Not in feedlots, not in the field, but in the laboratory. And there are lots of other innovations that are happening in agriculture. But climate change will make producing 70% more food more challenging. Climate change will result in changes in the temperature and precipitation regimes, so there will be agricultural winners and losers before the end of this century. But on balance, we lose. Experts predict agricultural production by 15 to 30% before the end of this century. Also, many of the world's major deltas, which are the major rice-producing areas, will be submerged by a rising sea and will be lost, and there will be increasing conflicts over fresh water in many parts of the world. Livestock take a particularly large toll, and they're a very important part of agriculture today. They require a lot of water, they require a lot of land, and also they emit significant amounts of greenhouse gas. In 2016, there were nearly 1 billion cattle worldwide. And if you look at agriculture as a whole, agriculture accounts for about 1/3 of all the greenhouse gas emitted globally, and livestock account for about 1/2 of that total. The ocean has been an important source of protein for many thousands of years. And as I mentioned, 70,000 years ago, it may even have saved our species from extinction. Today, the ocean produces about 16% of the world's animal protein. In some countries, it's 100%. That's impressive. But if you look at 71% of the earth that's covered by ocean, it contributes only about 2% of the total food supply based on a caloric value. That's not very impressive. It took many tens of thousands of years for the majority of humans to give up our hunter-gatherer lifestyle. That was true except in the 71% of the earth covered by seawater. There, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle still persists. We call it fishing. And it threatens to have an effect on marine life similar to what hunter-gatherers had on terrestrial life. On land, as our hunting tools became more sophisticated and human populations grew, we drove many of our prey to the brink of extinction, and we pushed some over the brink, like the woolly mammoth, 3 species of camels, the dodo, the saber-toothed tiger, passenger pigeon, and in North America, at least 25 other species alone were pushed to extinction. To date, we've driven a number of ocean species to economic extinction. That is, their populations are so low, they're no longer economic to fish. We've pushed others to ecosystem extinction. That is, their populations are so low, they no longer play the role they have traditionally played in marine ecosystems. And we've also driven a few to biological extinction, gone forever. Now, fishing is a very important source of animal protein, and it has a number of other benefits. It provides jobs, it conserves working waterfronts that are magnets for tourists, but fishing cannot meet the growing demand for seafood. Wild harvests have been flat for decades. According to a recent 2016 report of the UN, nearly 90% of global fish stocks are either fully fished or overfished. Through proper management, setting aside more and larger areas of the ocean for protection, some expansion of wild capture harvests is possible, but it will be modest, perhaps 10 to 15%. So what do we do? There is a way. In 1979, Jacques Cousteau reminded us we must plant the sea and herd its animals, using the sea as farmers instead of hunters. That is what civilization is all about, farming replacing hunting. The first question that we have to answer, though, is, can mariculture be sustainable? The Green Revolution was not so green. It's very clear that agricultural practices in the past have taken a toll both on land, on marine, and on the ocean. The world ocean is the largest single component of Earth's life support system. We rely upon it for essential ecosystem services, and those services depend upon having healthy, productive, diverse ecosystems. We can and must develop mariculture so that it does not take a toll on the ocean and marine ecosystems the way that agriculture has taken a toll on the land, on terrestrial plants and animals, and even on the coastal ocean. All indications are that we're going to rely much more on the ocean in the near future for food, minerals, shipping and transportation, energy, and this is the so-called Blue Revolution. It's happening. It's happening around the world, much less so in the United States. And we're going to depend more on the ocean in the future for recreation, for recreation, as we escape our overheated and overcrowded cities. The challenge is to allocate spaces in the multi-use ocean for legitimate ocean-dependent uses that benefit society and that are managed to ensure they do not adversely impact marine ecosystems. One of those uses is mariculture, and one of the tools is marine spatial planning. So, can we make mariculture sustainable? I think the answer is an unequivocal yes, if the farms are sited and operated properly, using the best management practices. Mariculture has many environmental advantages. It takes no land, very little fresh water except during processing, and then the amounts are small. It releases far fewer greenhouse gases than agriculture, and the releases of nutrients are small compared with those of agriculture. And as we all know, fish are far more efficient in converting feed to protein. And some forms of aquaculture can even contribute to ecosystem services. We know that seaweed improves water quality by removing excess nutrients. Shellfish improve water quality by filtering the water. Seaweeds and shellfish provide habitat. And seaweeds can even mitigate ocean acidification, at least in restricted coastal embayments, by removing CO2. But the two issues of greatest concern by the public, and we deal with the public, 1.72 million people every year. They're concerned about escapes and interbreeding, and they're concerned about feed. The feed, up until fairly recently, maybe a decade ago or so, was based primarily on fish meal. And the use of fish meal for farm fish raises a number of legitimate issues, including the removal of small pelagic fish from marine ecosystems where other fish, birds, and marine mammals depend upon them. But in the most current formulations of feed for farms, the fish component meal has been reduced significantly, largely through replacement with fish waste and plant material such as soybeans. And there are a lot of exciting things on the horizon. Microbial meals that create high-protein feed, culture of microalgae to produce algae-rich oils that are rich in amino acids, and even the culture of insects such as black soldier flies, whose larval stages can be used to create high-quality feed. But escapes can and do happen. No farmer wants to lose his livestock. And with modern cages and good management, the probability of escapes can be reduced significantly. And I think those farmers who allow their fish to escape should be held accountable. The benefits of growing animal protein in the ocean are clear scientifically, both from the perspective of environmental health and from human health. But perceptions don't match reality. We deal in a world of perceptions. And if we're going to tell our story in a convincing way, we've got to deal with perceptions openly and honestly. We have made mistakes in aquaculture, some bad ones. We've sited farms in the wrong places, we've overstocked cages, we've destroyed important coastal habitats like mangroves to make room for shrimp farms. We've sometimes devastated fisheries that are very important for menhaden and sardines, for example, that are important for ecosystems. We've done all those things, but that's the story of the past. It's not the story of the present, and it certainly is not the story of the future. And it's not our story. The challenge is to create and sustain a safe, secure, stable supply of nutritious food that is scalable to meet the needs of a growing population with the lowest environmental impact. I think it's very clear that neither agriculture nor wild capture fisheries are scalable to meet that challenge. The best approach is to develop a program of integrated sustainable agriculture and sustainable aquaculture that produces a much greater fraction of animal protein in the ocean. Wild capture fisheries will continue to play an important role, but it will be a supporting role. If we were to follow this approach, we would reduce water use, and fresh water is the looming challenge on the horizon globally. It's the only natural resource that is critical for all life, and it is the only one for which there is no replacement. It would reduce land use, greenhouse gas emissions, and it would produce a more healthful supply of protein. So the U.S. is a curious place. We are a leader in seafood sustainability, in fisheries management, seafood safety, workers' rights, tools and techniques to make aquaculture sustainable, but most of these get exported rather than right here at home. We are the largest importer of seafood. We import more than 91% of our seafood. Most of it comes from Asia with a large carbon footprint, and much of it is produced under undocumented environmental and social conditions. And we have a seafood trade deficit of $14 billion per year. The U.S. seafood supply is neither secure nor sustainable. Population in our major exporter, China, is growing, and the population of the middle class is growing even more rapidly. More and more Chinese can afford to buy seafood. They love it. They're going to buy it. They are buying it. And in the next few years, we will see China go from being the world's major exporter to perhaps being a significant importer of seafood. So, where will we get our seafood in the U.S.? We're going to have to become more self-sufficient. We have the largest exclusive economic zone of any country in the world. France is number 2. The EEZ goes from the shoreline out 200 nautical miles. A UN study recently concluded that of all the nations on Earth, the U.S. has the greatest potential for mariculture. And another study concluded that the U.S. could produce an amount of seafood equivalent to the total global wild catch in an area of the EEZ equivalent to the size of Lake Michigan. You can see Lake Michigan probably, if you know where to find it, in that slide. That would be less than 1/10 of 1% of the U.S. EEZ. It's ironic that in this nation, we don't bat an eye at devoting 45% of our entire land surface to agriculture, with much of that going to livestock. That's land that could be used to grow grains, fruits, and vegetables for humans. We lag behind the rest of the world in marine aquaculture. It accounts for just 6% of our total domestic food supply, and globally, we rank 17th in the world in aquaculture production, instead of that number one the UN said we should be. Scaling up is difficult, though. Securing permits in federal waters is difficult, costly, and time-consuming because the regulatory framework is complex and it lacks leadership. No federal agency has been designated to take the lead in the permitting process. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, should have that role, but it needs a legislative mandate. There is a bill now working its way through Congress to do that. We need a permitting process that is transparent, is based on the best science, and has much greater predictability, all without sacrificing standards to protect environmental quality. It needs to get to yes or to no in a much more efficient way. The current process is reminiscent of someone's description of a committee. It's a dark alley down which good ideas are dragged late at night and strangled to death. Scaling up will also be challenging because of perceptions. Perceptions have a big impact on the permitting process. Mark Twain once remarked, "A lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can even get its boots on." Listen to these statements from a new book, Clean Protein. You probably can't read those where you are, but let me just read a couple. More and more fish are raised on massive farms, which present an array of potential ecological problems. Fish can escape, causing the complete populations to collapse. They talk about using, this is a dreadful book, but it's a very popular book among all the foodies. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to get our boots on and get moving. We need to tell our story, and we need to get others to tell our story. Farming the sea is a legitimate and important human use, and if done properly, it can reduce pressures on wild stocks and can even help conserve and rehabilitate sensitive marine ecosystems. Eating more seafood as our source of animal protein would have significant environmental benefits and certainly human health benefits, because we all know that seafood is the healthiest animal protein on the planet. Research has shown that if we eat more seafood, we can reduce the risk of heart disease, improve brain development and function, help build muscle and tissues, and may even reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. The U.S. government recommends that we eat seafood at least twice a week, each serving 4 ounces or more. Today, we eat less than half that amount. Where will it come from? And will we know the conditions, environmental and human rights, under which it is produced? So let me offer a closing observation. I think the mariculture story is a story of hope. It's one of living in a world in which we can provide a growing population with a food supply that is safe, secure, stable, and healthful, and one which reduces the release of heat-trapping gases, uses less fresh water, and leaves more of the landscape for nature to conserve biodiversity. The biggest threat to biodiversity is the fragmentation of the landscape. We need to leave more of it in big, unbroken up chunks. And it's worth pointing out that mariculture has the potential to contribute to achieving all of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. We need to tell our story more often, in more compelling ways, and we need to get others to tell our story for us. I continue to believe that aquariums should be one of those groups of institutions who tell the aquaculture story. Surveys have shown that people trust aquariums, and they come to aquariums with a predisposition to care about marine life. So I leave you with one final thought. This is something your mother probably told you when you were growing up. You can lead a human to knowledge, but you can't make him think. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. Thank you.